Good evening, everybody. Uh, Good evening. We are here at the last slot in the Ignite stage to bring to you a few case studies for good practices on gender. So it's stories from the Asia Pacific, and we will present 4 stories very quickly. So this is basically a few success stories that we've got from the case studies that we used for this report, Women as a Force in Resilience Building and Gender Equity in DRR. This was the Key Area 4 report and the Asia Pacific report. So we collected stories from across Asia Pacific, and here are a few of those stories. Okay, so to begin with, we have one of the case studies. The first category is knowledge, one of the aspects. So we talked about, we asked the question whether there's a gendered knowledge gap, and if so, do we need to take into account the knowledge, the perspectives of both men and women when planning and implementing our work that affects them. So let's listen to our colleague from the Pacific with a story from Bua that illustrates this. Kairangi Samuela will tell us this story.
Kia ora, Nisambulavanaka from Fiji and the Pacific. Warm greetings, everyone. I'm actually just here to report on the case study, so I wasn't actually part of that case study. But yeah, just talk about these issues, and as a feminist and as a Pacific feminist, it's also would be interesting to listen to about the stories that happen around the Pacific as well. The province of Bua is located on the southern coast of Fiji's second largest island, Vanua Levu. Bua is sparsely populated with a total population of 14,000 people in 58 villages across the island. The economy is based on subsistence and some commercial fishing and agricultural activities, with the recent incursion of foreign companies engaged in bauxite mining as well as intermittent gold mining in the adjacent province. The local communities are experiencing hardships and disruption from the effect of climate change. Although these effects are compounded by unsustainable fishing and farming practices, and reported contamination and land degradation associated with mining and downstream locations. In practice, however, climate change impacts in Bua can be tentatively identified in terms of damage from tropical cyclones, intense rainfall and flooding, higher tides, and generally more variable and unpredictable weather patterns. The Wildlife Conservation Society's project work in Bua seeks to identify and document local practices for climate change adaptation and integrate these with science-based solutions that promote sustainable use and development of natural systems. In its dialogue with the community, WCS focuses on elements of the natural environment which would be observed at the grassroots level, which local people would notice as they go about their usual daily activities. There was a household survey conducted by WCS, and one of the questions posed investigated perceptions of seagrasses and their current status along their coastline. Seagrass is an important habitat for certain marine life that live in intertidal and shallow subtidal areas, and is also a food source for some fish and turtles. Damage to seagrass is considered as one indicator of the recent incidents of cyclones, heavy rainfall, and associated flooding. It was found that there was a higher percentage of women understood the status of what was happening in the shallow areas of the ocean, the ecological value of the seagrass compared with men. The women were also able to provide more details about what was going on as comparative to the men. They could also see what was happening in the rivers and across in the little shallow areas, and such as the disappearance of mussels, kaikoso, and in the rivers, the kainiwandranu. They also knew of the presence of mangrove crabs, and if something went different there, they would actually know if something had happened. Something different had happened, whether it was climate change related or not, shrimp and mud lobsters in the mangroves. And they acquired this knowledge through basic their daily subsistence lives. They would collect this just basically for their subsistence. The men, on the other hand, mainly engage in fishing activities outside in the oceans. This is quite typical across the Pacific. It's the women in the lagoons, closer to the shore, and outside in the oceans, it's the men who go out. There's also this cultural thing that if men go out into the oceans, the women have to stay at home because women get blamed if something happens to the men when they either don't catch any fish or something happens to them on the ocean. So the men go diving for sea cucumber, which is a viable fishing commercial resource for Mbua. And also, they also involved in commercial sales of the fish, in contrast to the women who focus on subsistence, collection of resources to feed their families. The men can also see the changes in the catches as to whether they're not catching in certain types of fish, mean either there's changes in the ocean temperatures, or if they don't see any sharks. There's quite a lot of shark injuries out of this. They don't see any sharks, there means that there's no fish for them to eat, so there must be something wrong. So obviously, but this also includes overfishing and destructive fishing practices may also add to this. The implications for climate change analysis is to recognize that women and men have different experiences of the environment. Just because you live in one village doesn't mean that your experience is the same as the women's experiences is the same as the men's. That input from both men and women are required to enrich analysis. And also to recognize and understand the diverse cultural expectations on men and women's roles in the community. Men are more likely to be the decision makers, they're more likely to be talked to by whoever comes to work with the villagers, whereas the women's usually a more submissive role. So they don't get to actually explain what they do, what they see. And also men and women have different indicators and markers of change. So these are just some of the indicators that came out of the survey that was done. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a warm night.
Yeah, you just stay around here, though. Thank you, Kairanga. So we have a couple more pictures from the Bua case study as well. The women, the men, and the whole consultative process. Yeah, so we have another case study from Assam. We don't have the gentleman from Assam to present it, so I'll quickly talk about training, where training was carried out, where the target audience were educators and women teachers in particularly were targeted because we felt that the women were able to take it, were more effective in it. So training of officials within all the implementing organizations. The case study found the training and the whole exercise in Assam found that that was very effective because they had done it previously where it was largely men, and then they insisted and made sure that the women, the teachers were involved, and that made a big difference to the impact of the case study. There was also a special focus on girls' participation in the practical exercises like the evacuation drills and so forth. So that is where training, a case study where training made a big difference. Networking, we have a case study from Tirukkovil where women, basically the community had lost, incurred a lot of losses, and there were a lot of women-headed households. But what it made people realize that when there are women-headed households, they have to take on roles that they normally don't take on. So this was used by the Women's Rural Development Society to kind of cash in and say that if they can take decisions of a productive nature, not just the reproductive nature, they can jolly well, take decisions in the social sphere. And then they came together in order to do that. And the space with men had to be negotiated to let them, the their individual stories had to be explained to them to give them the space in the public. Yeah, so we also have we had another case study from the Japan Women's Network on writing the gender perspective in the Japan 6 disaster legislation. So we'll stop there for a minute because we're running out of time and it will be better to use the remaining 5 minutes to discuss. So Kairangi, if you will just come over here, we can perhaps, if you have any questions on any of these case studies, we'll be happy to discuss, or any comments that you have.
Do we have any questions? If we don't, I can also talk about another area that the gendered knowledge is actually important in terms of responding to disasters. When we're looking at disasters, I was just talking to the gentleman here, as what's women's position. A lot of us tend to think that, I mean, I'll talk about for my own country, the Cook Islands. Disasters are seen as a man's thing because they're to protect women, they're there to protect the children, so they know best. Whereas we know that, I mean, that women are actually the ones who actually, when we talk to a number of women, we ask them, I come from low-lying areas, what happens when there's a cyclone? What do the men do? Oh, they board up the house. They get all sorts of stuff and board up the house and make sure that the house has been, I don't know, protected from the cyclone so that the roof doesn't blow off. What do you do as women? We gather the children, we get the food, we make sure that everything that we need to survive during and after the cyclone is there. So that's two dual areas too, that men and women differ in how they approach disasters. And then even afterwards, when we're thinking about women not only as victims of disasters, but also as service providers. Teachers, female teachers are expected to go back to work a week after a disaster has struck without counselling. So they're expected to go back to normal, but psychologically they're still not normal. But one of the positive things that arose out of a cyclone we had in the Cook Islands about 4 years ago was that the Ministry of Health recognised that nurses weren't able to address people in medical emergencies on the island because they were also suffering from it. The nurses were also victims of the cyclone, so they actually brought nurses in. The first response sometimes we do is let's send in the doctors, but we know it's the nurses that do all the work. The doctors sit and diagnose. And then they send them out and the doctors are predominantly male. And then they send them out to the nurses who are predominantly women, who actually do the hard work, who do the counselling, who do the bandaging, who actually look after the family as a whole. So that was something that positive was government recognising that the nurses on that island couldn't address it. So let's send nurses from another island who weren't affected, who could help.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kairanga. Caitlin, can you take a minute we just got a minute, or half a minute to explain what you did with the Japan's Women's Network.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Caitlin Stranell. I work for the Japan Women's Network on Disaster Risk Reduction. And I have 1 minute to explain an entire policy change. But basically, I think that obviously the 3/11 disasters in Japan were very huge disasters. And after that, the women, everyone in Japan, I think, thought they looked in horror at the television and thought, what can we do? And the women were very, very strong and came together in huge solidarity right across the country. And I think also the government itself was quite receptive at that point. So there were just a very, very long series of very determined petitions to government ministers. We managed to round up all of the female, although there's not that many women MPs in Japan, we got all of them on board. And at that particular time, it created enough pressure to change some very significant laws and to make some quite big differences on the ground. I'll just give you one very quick example. In Japan, there's local disaster committees, and the people who can be on the local disaster committees were by law, they had to be within certain work occupations, which usually meant they were emergency workers or firefighters. They were usually men. So basically women were being excluded from the local disaster committee because they weren't in those jobs. So one of the big changes was to broaden the spectrum of jobs that would allow people to be in these committees. And we made it so that it was academics, it was experts in other different fields, which meant that now slowly the number of women in these local committees is actually going up. So these, I think, policy changes have their limitations, but this was a good example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're out of time. Thank you.